Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome back to our Summer Health Policy Series. Today, we have an outstanding panel to talk to us about drug development and pricing in COVID-19 and beyond. And we have two more sessions coming up on COVID-19 as part of our series, one on payers and one on public health lessons and philanthropy. So we look forward to having you join us for those. So today, I want to welcome Mary Kosinski. She is the Chief of Staff and Deputy Vice President for Science and Regulatory Advocacy at the Pharmaceutical Research and Manufacturers of America, PhRMA. Previously, she was Senior Advisor to the Biomedical Advanced Research and Development Authority, BARDA, at HHS. And before BARDA, she was a Senior Policy Advisor to the Assistant Secretary for Preparedness and Response. So Mary, welcome. We also have with us Peter Bach, who is the director of the Memorial Sloan Kettering Center for Health Policy and Outcomes, and he leads the Drug Pricing Lab. As physician and epidemiologist, his work is focused on the cost and value of anti-cancer drugs. And of course, he's been leading efforts to help policymakers and the public understand U.S. drug development process and creating new models for drug pricing that include value to patients. So welcome, Peter. We look forward to hearing about your work. And we have Marta Wosinska, who is the Deputy Director of Policy at the Duke Margolis Center for Health Policy and a consulting professor at the Duke Fuqua School of Business. You recently spent a year as an economic advisor on the U.S. Senate Finance Committee, supporting work on drug markets and drug pricing. And before that, you were Chief Healthcare Economist in the Office of the Inspector General, and spent 7 years at the Food and Drug Administration, working on a range of economic issues related to drugs and biologics. So thank you as well for joining us. So we are going to start today with Mary. We're a little bit out of order because we thought it was really important to have Mary start us off and talk about the pharmaceutical industry's coronavirus response effort. And from there, we can then delve into some policy issues. So Mary, could you provide an overview for us, please?
Sure. Thanks, Alison, and thank you all for being here today. I acknowledge that I am standing in for one of my ably-bodied colleagues on the advocacy team. So while my aperture is primarily in the science and regulatory space, I do draw on a background in pandemic preparedness, and I've had the privilege of working with many of you in other capacities over the last 20 years. So thanks for having me here today. What I wanted to start us out with today is really just a framework for how we as the pharmaceutical industry, but also as the ecosystem, are committed to working to support not just the U.S., but an ex-U.S. commitment for beating coronavirus. So I want to highlight a couple different items. I know we're going to delve deep into the therapeutics considerations, get into some back and forth, but as we frame this, I want to remind everybody it's really a three-legged stool that we think about, starting with diagnostics, therapeutics, and vaccines. And strategically, you have to think about all these medical countermeasures together, and that includes all members of the ecosystem. So as the pharmaceutical industry, we leaned in very quickly to screen our global libraries of medicines, but also to think about innovative treatment options and diagnostic needs. We looked at our unique manufacturing capabilities across all of the different modalities and tried to think about what opportunities we had not only to partner, but also to reach within our capacities. We've looked at our technical capabilities, and we thought through the different opportunities to partner with the U.S., whether it's Operation Warp Speed, with BARDA, with DARPA, but also thought about our ex-U.S. partnerships. And I think that that's one of the things that we're going to talk through as we collaborate, not just with the other parts of the ecosystem, everything from academic medical centers to individual researchers, but as we think through the other parts of the conversation that are maybe less contemplated, as we partner with the FDA, for example, as they think through some of their clinical research needs to make sure routine trials outside of this public health emergency are addressed. We're sharing these learnings in real time, and we work through the data sharing options on a day-to-day basis, not only as individual companies, but as a collective industry. And we're working with the governments here, and I say that both at the state and local levels, as well as at the federal government here in the U.S. and global communities. So on this next slide, I think that this is a great landscape. I'm happy to pause here before we delve in any more deeply as we think about the diagnostics, existing medicines, new treatments, vaccines, and the overarching manufacturing capacity. I know that Marta and our colleagues from the Duke Margolis Center yesterday held a great opportunity via webinar to talk about capacity for manufacturing, and it was focused on therapeutics, but understanding some of those things as you contemplate antibiotics and monoclonal antibodies are shared for sterile fill lines. And so thinking about the vaccines, you can't look at any individual countermeasure in isolation. And that's an important consideration as we go through today's discussion. And I know that we should be thinking about these lessons learned well into the fall. So I'll take a quick pause. I know that as we think through the starting point for diagnostics, Alison, you might want to pivot to some of my colleagues on the panel, or we could just remind folks that there are quite a number of diagnostic and serological tests that are out there, and I acknowledge that you can unpack that in multiple different ways. And as you think about the landscape, that's sometimes a safe way to start the discussion. So maybe I'll pause now, Alison, and give it back to you.
And then I believe, Mary, you have a slide that even tells us how many sort of therapeutic, clinical trials that we have underway to give people a sense of sort of where this, the new innovation frontiers lie at the moment. Excellent.
Sure.
Thank you so much for that. Go ahead.
Yeah. No, I will just say, it's not about the quantity of trials, it's about the quality of trials. And so I don't want to get too fixated on any number. Seeing over 1,000 clinical trials going on globally is quite a thing, right? I mean, when you look at the WHO reported numbers, you look at clinicaltrials.gov, but when you actually parse out what that means, where those trials are enrolled, how that's actually advancing the science that's going to be available for regulatory decision making, those are the questions you really want to be driving at. And so it's important to know it's all hands on deck, but that we don't want to sacrifice the existing public health needs in this pandemic either. And so I appreciate that it's a balance. And so as we pause on all of these efforts, I think it's an important reminder that we're all contributing, it's an ecosystem, and that it's not just about the numbers, it's about the individual people and the cases that we're learning.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. So Peter, and part of our challenge in this drug pricing space is we're balancing affordability and access is to support innovation and to ensure affordability. And we typically see a pattern of a high launch price for breakthrough products and then declining prices for follow-on brands such as biosimilars or generic chemotherapy. Now, your research finds that isn't always the case, that drug prices can be high at launch and also post-launch. Can you tell us a little bit about your work in this area and what conclusions you draw?
Well, sure, Alison, and then I also have some slides if you'd like me to go through them. But
through those.
Let me just say, actually, some of the setup for that question isn't actually that accurate. Mostly biosimilars, which are kind of generic versions of biologic drugs, complex molecules, enter the U.S. market, and even still today, even when there are multiple biosimilars, there's not a single biosimilar on the market that is selling for a price that is below the launch price of any biologic it's intended to displace. So it's actually because there's long-standing price inflation over time, and these drugs are often on the market for well more than a decade, sometimes 20 years. By the time the biosimilar comes along, it looks like a bargain only because prices have been jacked up so much over time, but they're not actually, we're not seeing discounts there. We have never had a case where brand-to-brand competition has driven prices down to anything close to cost plus, which I'll talk about. And even the generics market only functions in certain sectors, not others. I also think it's worth, I love Mary's slide here. I think it's worth putting these numbers in perspective. It's difficult probably for your audience to look at the 1,228 clinical trials and get a sense like, is that a lot? Is it a little? Obviously, it sounds like a lot. But just for some perspective, that's approximately the number of ongoing trials of immunotherapies in oncology alone today. So it's really not that impressive. It's obviously very, very important we get these trials done. But as a sector of investment from the pharmaceutical sector, they're equally, and this is, of course, not all pharma-sponsored trials. In fact, the trials that have had the biggest impact are government-run trials, both in the U.S. and the UK. But even here, this is not sort of this overwhelming once-in-a-lifetime opportunity or situation from these trials that have been launched.
All right, take us into your slides.
I'm happy to. I think I'm supposed to be in control now. So which is very exciting for me. But I think I'm in Mary's deck. If I keep going, will I get to my deck?
Let's see. I'm sure Terang is here.
Terang, can you? I feel like I know something about drug pricing, but very little about WebEx.
All right. We're getting there.
Here we go. Perfect.
Upcoming seminar social marketing.
Yep.
We're getting close.
Yep.
Peter,
Thanks for having me.
Start? There we go. There we go. Perfect. Thank you.
Thanks, and thanks, Terang. All right, so these are the slides I brought to this seminar, and I just want to put some perspective on topics. I'm going to talk a little bit about the drug remdesivir, which is an antiviral drug from a company called Gilead that has shown in a couple of studies now that it can shorten the duration of coronavirus infection, or not infection, but symptoms. But I'm going to talk more generally. And I want to put the entire issue of drug pricing into a perspective that I think is helpful. This is a figure, or a version of a figure from a paper my colleagues and I had in the New England Journal, what I think was actually a few months ago, though it feels several lifetimes ago. And what it is a schematic of what I would characterize as an entirely artificial and policy-defined marketplace for new drugs. And the reason I display it this way is that I'm trying to put into context the challenge we face when determining what, from a policy perspective, is an appropriate price for a drug. And I do this in this larger frame to emphasize that we cannot kind of ignore this question because it is just a component of all of the sort of questions that policymakers have already tried to tackle. So going from left to right, what you see here is a kind of archetype of the development of a new drug that ultimately receives FDA approval and what the profits are to the company during the course of that life cycle. Now, drugs, of course, begin when they are unproven in this, and companies need to spend money. On the y-axis are their profits. You'll see the little zero there, which reflects when their profits are positive versus negative. And the profits are negative during this innovation period because they are spending money but not able to sell, so they're not making any money. Then, due to the descriptions in policy and statute and regulation, the FDA defines when the innovation has produced enough data to allow market entry. In other words, the market is entirely dictated by the FDA's kind of yes or no for getting on it. And standards set in place over a very long period of time exist here about what does it mean to be safe, what does it mean to be effective, and there's multiple policies that help companies break this bar here into the market more easily, like breakthrough designation, fast track approval, and accelerated approval. Then the drugs get into this period of monopoly where they have no competition in the sense that no other company can make the exact same product. The FDA protects them, patents protect them, and during that time, profits are large because they're able to charge prices based on their monopoly rather than on competition. At some point, that monopoly is time limited and the drugs lose exclusivity, and entrants into the market drive down prices. Now, policy also affects those. What can be a generic drug? What can be a biosimilar? How quickly can it enter the market? How quickly can the next drug enter the market? What are the scientific standards for those things? And the idea is at the end of this monopoly with the entrance of competition, eventually prices and therefore profits fall down to what people would usually call a market profit, or you could think of zero profit or just sort of a competitive price. So it's really important to understand we've constructed all of these things, and I can point you to every law and reg that does it, and yet when we talk about profits during the monopoly period, we say, okay, we'll let the market dictate them. So this entire artificial structure somehow needs to be dictated in that one thing, in the height of that box in the middle by the marketplace. So let me just show you, here's an example of the Orphan Drug Act of 1983 and how it affected the structure of this reward box. It lowered the cost of innovation, it made FDA approval easier, it lengthened the period of exclusivity, all increasing companies' profits for orphan drugs, all else being equal. Here's the 21st Century Cures Act. I'm having trouble controlling my slides, which also reduced the bar for FDA approval with expedited review. It allowed promotion of off-label use or marketing around off-label use as well, which increased the profits during the monopoly period. Here's the CHPRE-HAP Act of 2019, which allowed faster entry and less pay for delay, if you will, allowing a faster slope downward after a loss of exclusivity. And so if you think about this as an artificial market with essentially artificial or policy-defined prices, what are the options for pricing a drug like remdesivir, which I know Marta is also, or I believe Marta is going to discuss. So you could just take the view, look, well, you should do cost plus pricing. The drug can be produced, let's say, for $10 a treatment course. A group in Boston called ICER said that number. But whatever it is, it's like pay companies back for the manufacturer and give them a sort of market profit, fully loaded. The price is going to be a very low number. You could say, well, we should pay based on the value of the therapy. Said it's, for example, we should pay $50,000 for a quality-adjusted life year. And again, ICER said that number is about $5,000 for remdesivir, taking, if you will, a very optimistic view of the data on the drug, which actually has not statistically convincingly shown to prevent death. You could take a view of accounting-based pricing. So give the company, in this case Gilead, the monetary savings the drug produces. So remdesivir does shorten hospital stay by a couple of days. That would save about the average bed day in a hospital is reimbursed in the U.S. about $2,500. So the 2-day decline would be also worth about $5,000. And then, or you could say, we have this artificial structure. We should pay what is needed to reward or spur the innovation. We should give that much money so that the next company says, hey, that was worth it. I'm going to go develop a new drug. And the question is, who knows what that number is? So because nobody really has a good handle on how much it costs to spur innovation, we mostly argue about the other three ideas. Cost plus pricing, as I said, sort of the $10 thing. That's what healthy competition with, let's say, generics would produce. That target for generic competition, as I mentioned, is sometimes reached, but not routinely. It is for things like statins and ACE inhibitors and diuretics. Value-based pricing, again, this $50,000 per quality, or about $5,000 for a treatment course, is based on a theory of allocation equilibrium. If you are willing to spend $50,000 for a quality and for health, but no more, the consequence is any higher price for a drug than, let's say, the $5,000 I showed in the last slide, means the money you spend on that drug could have better uses. That's the idea of allocation. We shouldn't give $1 million for a quality adjusted life year because we could produce a lot more welfare by spending that money somewhere else. The accounting-based pricing is often brought up by the pharmaceutical industry and the sort of array of experts when and only when treatments prevent other costs. So they would tout, for example, the savings from shortened hospital stay, but you don't hear about it when a treatment actually triggers, let's say, a bone marrow transplant that costs $500,000, which would otherwise turn prices negative. But what it does, and I'm going to talk about this, is it essentially internalizes the inflated cost structure of the U.S. healthcare system, and I'll explain why I think that. And then there's this idea of incentive-based price, as I pointed to in the prior slide. Pay enough to stimulate further innovation, and it's possible to get at those kinds of things from the market, like running an auction or a bid structure, where you'd say to companies, well, hey, what is the reward you would need to develop a new vaccine, for example, and let the companies bid to do it, take the lowest bids or something like that. And at that point, the company has essentially signaled to you, hey, this is the prize I need based on my risk-adjusted chance of success to go do this, and I'll go fight it out competitively with other companies. And my colleague Mark Trusheim and I proposed doing this for vaccines a few months ago for COVID specifically. Now, with this inflated cost structure, I just want to point out how important this is. So it was commonly argued a few years ago that the Hep C treatments, again, a Gilead drug, Sovaldi, later Harvoni, Maverat, save money by reducing the frequency of liver transplants. But just to be clear, oh, I have a typo here, I'm sorry. The cost of a liver transplant in the US is about 65%, not 2.5x, pardon me, it's about 1.6x, as much in the US as in the OECD average. So if we say we're saving this money in the US, we are essentially baking in the high cost of liver transplant into the high cost of a drug. Here, we are expecting a gene therapy to treat hemophilia It would substitute for factor VIII, the blood clotting factors we give people because their genetic defect fails to allow them to have enough of this to protect them. But again, if you ask the question, if you're substituting for factor VIII products, should you factor that into a gene therapy price? Well, the U.S. prices for these products are way higher, as you can see on the left-hand side, than they are for in other countries. So should we bake in our inflated cost for these other drugs so we have an inflated cost for gene therapy? That doesn't seem particularly rational, nor in the direction of bending the cost curve. On the right-hand side, you can actually see the entry and the payment amounts or prices in a casual sense of these various factor VIII therapies on the right-hand graph over time. And you can see that the fact that more have entered the market has not led to price declines in any sense of the term, which is why I mentioned earlier that we don't see, when we see brand-to-brand competition, we don't see price declines. By the way, many of these factor VIIIs are eligible for biosimilar competition, but there is no biosimilar competition. And if you look at remdesivir and you ask, well, as I said, a hospital bed day in the US, give or take, is about $2,500, something like that. As you can see, that's on the right-hand chart. But we pay way more for a hospital bed day than other countries do. You can see Australia and Switzerland relative to the US on the left-hand side. And those data are somewhat old. That's 2014. So you can see the price inflation on the right-hand side. The prices have not inflated in these other countries. So if we say we should get the savings from remdesivir, should we get the savings from our prices in hospitals being overpriced? Or should we, which just drives the inflationary spiral, or should we be anchoring them to something else? So we should actually be trying in nearly all cases to pay at a level of the needed incentive. In other words, we should pay enough that the next company wants to take the plunge and try and develop a new therapy. We should also pay efficiently and intelligently, not pay excessive amounts for drugs that barely work, because the signal that sends to the market is get on the market, not get on the market with a highly effective drug. I don't think any companies are sandbagging, but it's still pretty inefficient if the reward is pretty even, no matter the health benefits you create. But the things I want to sort of either debunk or at least discuss, if other folks disagree, is, when we look at the treatments for tackling COVID, we should be laser focused on these incentives for the industry. We will hear from the industry that the value of society of tackling COVID is enormous. That's undoubtedly true, trillions of dollars likely, but it's really irrelevant to the pricing. We shouldn't be transferring more of society's wealth to these companies than we need to get them to perform for the benefit of society. And remember, we are still operating under financial constraints. We're already hearing, the next stimulus may happen, may not happen. Apparently now people want to give money to people in Arizona to go on vacation. But there's a question of what kind of uses of money are appropriate. There's obviously 40 some odd million people, I guess, out of work at this point. There's a lot of people who are financially really under stress. Money we put to one thing actually cannot go to some other thing. We can't continue to print money, although we've taken a good run at it so far. And as for REM, which is sort of the shorthand for remdesivir, I do want to remember that when we're thinking about the rewards to the company, because those are the signals to future companies, the first thing to remember is that in the case of coronavirus particularly, there are huge non-monetary benefits to the company of getting on the market with a treatment that improves the outcome for society. And those should not be zeroed out when we think about the rewards they get or how other companies in the future will view their prospects in this space. We know this actually. We don't have to ask Gilead. A whole bunch of drug companies are actually, Johnson & Johnson as an obvious example, has said they're going to go no profit on vaccines. Now, I don't know exactly how the accounting will work, but here's a situation where they could try to capture the full value, whatever that is, of the vaccine, and they're explicitly saying they will not do that. I take no profit to be a version of production costs plus. And for them to do that means the value of coming on the market to treat people and not charging for it exceeds the value to them of charging for it, which means this gets to the first bullet. There's other reasons to look at remdesivir specifically and say, look, not this one, not because there's a penalty to Gilead or anything like that. It's just we don't really have to worry about how other companies will react if the price of remdesivir is low. First of all, remdesivir is sort of an old drug. This was resuscitated after a failure for its use in Ebola. It wasn't developed for this purpose. And so it's not really the sort of shot on goal that we usually think about with biotech innovation. And the other is that the development, the clinical studies of the drug were actually not even run by the company. They were run by the government and financed by it. The company provided drug only. And in the meantime, the company actually did run a study of their drug, but they didn't include a control group. So their studies were not adequate for regulatory approval. And so that's, again, not a criticism of Gilead, although I've been very critical of Gilead for doing that. But it's not a criticism in this context. It's just framing the issue to say, look, we could easily say, these are the caveats why in the case of remdesivir, we don't have to pay a huge price. And other companies will not look at this and say, oh, well, innovation's dead. We'll never get our reward. We can't go public next year and that kind of stuff, because this is a very special case along multiple axes. So in other words, any price can be justified based on the rubric I've laid out. But I actually think from a policy perspective, short of taking the company's patents, any pricing will be viewed as a one-off. And remember, the purpose of the artificial pricing monopoly system is to encourage these future innovators. They get signals from pricing of current medicines. And I also want to pause for a minute, and this gets back to Mary's point too, to realize that hoping innovation will be our salvation is already a failing strategy. And I want to emphasize this by the graph shown below. You can see there has been no breakthrough therapy in Europe that we don't have in the US or anything like that. There's no vaccine in Europe. And shown below are the rates of new cases of COVID in Europe and the US. And we seem to be waiting for a technological breakthrough when traditional public health has greatly improved the outcomes of people who are not sitting around waiting for that innovation. So thank you again for having me today.
Excellent. Thank you for that interesting and provocative presentation. So Marta, turning to you, please. We think about the FDA's principal mission as protecting patient safety and embracing the goal of promoting clinical innovation and access to new therapies. Those seem like particularly important goals today. What in this characterization of drug pricing do you see a little bit differently? I know you've done some work around the supply chain. What are we missing here? And is pricing really the only tool that we should be considering?
Thanks, Alison, for this question. So I did not prepare slides, but it's sort of a great follow-on. Now having seen actually Mary's and Peter's presentation, I will try to sort of respond to some of what they have presented. But first, let me actually tell you one other piece about my background. So I am an economist by training, but because I ended up doing my dissertation on drug advertising, I ended up at the marketing department at the Harvard Business School. So I started my academic career as a marketing professor. And there I got exposed to how marketers think about pricing. And what's really intriguing is that they use terminology that now we consider sort of new hot topic, value-based pricing, but value-based pricing is sort of marketing one-on-one for any product. It's not a new concept. By the way, I'm seeing things freezing. Am I freezing for you guys? Okay.
A little bit.
So hopefully it'll get better. It was not a problem a little bit earlier. So the way folks in marketing think about pricing is that you look at the willingness to pay that the buyer might have for a product, and that sort of is your ceiling for a price. And then you need to consider the floor for the price is the marginal cost, which actually, I will come back to this, incorporates actually the opportunity cost of not selling that product. And then, where you set the price is somewhere in the middle. And there's a number of factors that affect it. It is whether you can charge different people, different customers have different value to the product. If you can charge different prices, you might be able to set prices differently. Competition clearly is going to drive down the price and put pressure on the price downward. And then there's also the behavioral pricing, which are the issues around fairness. And you might not be able to charge a higher price because people will perceive it as unfair, and there is, you know, sort of, you can't sort of engage in the kind of economic rational pricing that you would like. And sort of, you know, what's interesting, so marketers talk about creating value. So what is the value that this product creates? And so for a drug, it could be that it's, you know, kind of the quality adjusted life year for a patient, but it also saves the insurer a certain number of days hospitalized. So there's this sort of accounting-based pricing. It could be that it makes the doctor's life easier because whatever they were doing now they can do much more efficiently because the drug isn't administered in a different way. So there are all these sort of components of value, and then the job of a marketer, and this is again true for any company, whether or not they're sort of in the drug space or not, their job is to try to extract that value. And that's sort of like standard marketing pricing 101. So what happens typically is that companies, you know, really do look at, you know, what is their competition? And the competition might not be another drug. It could be that the next best alternative, which is really the competition, is hospitalizations. And they try to, so this is the accounting-based pricing, take that into account. To what extent is there science and clinical trials showing what is the value of the product? So that also is going to determine that. So they will, you know, clearly try to create a lot of information around what the drug is worth and to whom. They will do studies with focus groups, with insurers, with doctors, and try to kind of make that assessment as they're setting up the price. What's really interesting in the COVID space is that I think that rule goes a bit kind of out the window. And remdesivir is sort of an interesting example, because when you look at a product like this, I don't think you can price this product just looking at that product anymore. There's so much scrutiny at this point on any product that's coming to market. What I find really interesting about remdesivir is that it's been in use for now, over a month. The company still has not put forward a price. ICER has issued its sort of range, which was, I think, from Peter, you correct me if I'm wrong, from $14 to like several thousand, what they said. So huge range. There's a lot of uncertainty around the value of the product. You know, Wall Street folks are saying, oh, they should charge $5,000. But I think especially for Gilead that got really beat up for Sovaldi, they are very conscious about what kind of a signal the price will have. Not only that, but they're running out of the supply of the product. And that's really critical because they're going to be kind of in the crosshairs for potential shortages. What's really interesting is that they just announced, I think yesterday, that they're going to be actually licensing with a number of generic manufacturers to try. This is really unthinkable for any other product that's an innovator to try to manage this. So this is not pricing remdesivir and the product. This is pricing, I would say, the Gilead brand. I think there's just so much more to this than just the product and the value it creates. This is really managing public relations, especially in the context of the likely drug shortages. So I'll talk about this a little bit. Something that we really never think about in the drug context is the marginal cost. Marginal cost for drugs, even for biologics, is really quite low, and it never really sort of surfaces in any way. The reason why it surfaces now with COVID products is that, and for remdesivir, is when you have limited manufacturing capacity. So marginal cost actually does reflect opportunity cost. And when you have limited manufacturing capacity, your opportunity cost is basically taking other drugs off the market and producing that instead. but you have contractual agreements and you have a steady demand, and these products probably are much higher margin. And when you also are going, so it's sort of a really tricky situation to be in. Not only would you be potentially charging a high price, but then you can't deliver the product. And so, I think Gilead is sort of in this really tricky situation about how to manage these two sides of this coin. And in terms of sort of incentives, I don't know how much thinking they were doing ahead of this and planning for all of this, but how they proceed and how successful they're going to be managing this. I mean, sort of like the worst case scenario is, on a kind of pile on top of this is if the president steps in, uses the Defense Act, and basically says, Gilead, I don't care, take off these other, high margin products, you're making this. That is sort of like the nightmare scenario. And so I think how this plays out for Gilead, and I think they're very conscious of it, is going to set the stage and kind of signal how this might play out for a lot of other manufacturers in this space. So even setting, just one more thing, even setting aside the sort of the pricing component, that's one reason we have been focusing a lot about the manufacturing capacity issue, because it is a significant bottleneck in this space. We really don't want that to be the constraint in putting products out on the market and creating just really huge problems.
Great. So Mary, thank you so much, Marta. Mary, picking up on that point, can you tell us a little bit about Operation Warp Speed and the sort of innovation in, to the extent you view it as that, in the policy space? Because my understanding is part of that motivation was to prepare in advance for manufacturing capacity. Can you tell us a little bit about Operation Warp Speed? And for audience, now we're going to shift over to the vaccine side, but tell us sort of where you see these two different policy spaces and the two different kinds of policies we're deploying when it comes to vaccine versus therapeutics.
Sure. Thanks, Marta, and thanks, Alison, for this question, because I think that as we talk a little bit about what we know of the U.S. government strategy, and we think back to the 2005-2006 U.S. pandemic preparedness efforts, which were built around H5N1 and then implemented in H1N1 in the 2009-2010 timeframe. We've got some lessons learned, and I believe that this administration, and right now with Moncef Slaoui, who's leading the Operation Warp Speed charge on vaccines. Dr. Janet Woodcock has temporarily left the FDA as the CDER director, and Dr. Cavazzoni is currently filling in as acting director there, while she then shifts over to support Operation Warp Speed on their therapeutics campaign. So I would acknowledge that we do have some tested leadership in those spaces. So I view that we have to think about these as complementary, because as we said in the pre-session, there's a lot of things that as you think about capacity and technical requirements that you do need to be thinking about all of the medical countermeasures at play. It's not just about the operational sterile fill lines or the limitations of auxiliary products like glass vials. It's really also about, as we've talked about, the manufacturing trade-offs and those individual company decisions that would be necessary. So what we do know from Operation Warp Speed, and we have given the government recommendations to be as transparent and public about this information as possible. And so I think that that is a drumbeat that we should all consider as part of the ecosystem that we need to continue to advocate for them to share some of their strategy. I think that as we think through the therapeutic side, we do understand that there's been a focus in certain modalities that have shown promise in treating the sickest patients. And I know that that's something that many individual companies have met with the government around. I understand that much like how the Operation Warp Speed is prioritizing vaccine candidates who can produce in the third and fourth quarter of 2020, I think that there is a similar time frame that they're envisioning for scale-up of the capacity for I believe it's now identified as monoclonal antibodies as a priority to treat the sickest patients. I would encourage us all to continue to ask these good questions and unpack what that means in terms of, as Marta has brought together groups to understand where BARDA has prioritized, where DARPA has prioritized, where the various federal entities have prioritized putting their resources down because those directly correlate to not only capacity, but prioritization, which is, I think, what we need to think about when we are talking through any sort of public health responses. How are we prioritizing the patients? How are we prioritizing the treatments? And how are we thinking through those requirements and then the scenarios that they would be utilized in? And that really talks through a lot of the assumptions that we think about much further upstream, because at the end of the day, we need to make sure that we can get people healthy as soon as possible and trying to understand what it is that's necessary to get them there. And so Operation Warp Speed has talked about neutralizing antibodies as their priority. We, the pharmaceutical industry, are working together. So we represent the 35 innovative biopharmaceutical companies. We partner very closely with our sister association, Bio, but that each individual company is obviously still having conversations with not just the regulatory authorities, but the various players. So Operation Warp Speed has those two pillars, and then I believe it's RADx that's focused on the diagnostics and housed out of NIH. So it's all of these public-private partnerships. We're also having conversations with the Gates Foundation, who are very interested in the longitudinal aspects of COVID and acknowledging that their accelerator is focused on the ex-US needs and understanding that scale-up capacity isn't just for the 6 to 1 year time frame, but really the 3 to 5 year time frame as we think through any needs in the ex-US space as well. So that's really what we know. I think that we all have the good stewardship to continue to ask those questions.
Great.
So Alison, if I can add a few comments about Operation Warp Speed. For very good reasons, there is a tremendous amount of focus on vaccines. And we have all been hearing how we're going to have a vaccine approved in the fall. While I do believe it's quite possible that we will have, an emergency use authorization in the fall, it will take a lot to immunize, millions and, hundreds of millions of Americans. And, we're not the only country in the world. There's a lot of other people that need to be immunized. So there's been a lot of, all hands on deck trying to coordinate these efforts. The government has been involved, the Operation Warp Speed, into actually trying to prioritize vaccines. They chose 5 candidates out of a lot that showed the greatest promise. They are really getting them, ramping up manufacturing in advance so that when they do launch, there's going to be, not necessarily sufficient supply, but a significant amount of supply ready to go. Some of it is going to be at risk. Some of these products might not actually make it to market or turn out not to be as effective. But there's a tremendous amount on vaccines. But again, I just wanted to kind of say why we still really want to be thinking about therapeutics. And it's for 2 reasons. Number one, again, we're not going to be able to, like within a month, inoculate all of, Americans. That's just not going to happen. And number 2, and that's really important, even if we have a vaccine, it might not be like a lot of the vaccines that we're familiar with that were, that we're not going to, that you have complete immunity and you cannot necessarily get sick. They might not be fully effective. And not only that, the people who are probably going, and this is, Peter is an epidemiologist, Peter might, and he's a medical doctor, so he will probably correct me if I'm wrong, Peter, but people with weak immune systems might not have the kind of immunological response to a vaccine, and therefore might actually be still at high risk, even after having been immunized, at having adverse events and impact. So the rush to develop therapeutics is not just a short-term thing, but we also kind of need it for medium and potentially long-term if this disease becomes endemic, which probably is likely. So, but there isn't nearly as much hands-on deck that you can see. I mean, Mary might have more insights, but you don't see as much coming out of Operation Warp Speed about let's prioritize which product we're going to try to invest in. Let's try to, kind of connect on the manufacturing side. There isn't nearly as much coordination, or at least as visible publicly as it is on the vaccine side. And I think that's really important. And perhaps it is going on, but just like Mary says, we need more transparency, and we should be pushing for this kind of coordination. So, but then I also need to ask Peter, what does he think about my characterization of remdesivir crisis issues?
If you don't mind, I do want to pivot because you raised an interesting point, which is you raised this question of if we have a vaccine, we're not going to get it out there that quickly. And that reminds me that when it came to testing, there was a lot of public and policy attention to the inequities that occurred in the distribution of the COVID-19 testing. So we removed co-payments for insured individuals and under Medicare and Medicaid, but only later did we fund testing for individuals without insurance. So Peter, what are your thoughts on, can we do a better job on equity when it comes to either the vaccine or to new treatments, and how might you think of those differently?
Well, thank you for asking me that question. We won't. We don't. So it's true that COVID has exposed all of the glaring problems we have in our health thing that some people call a system, but that has no systemness. We can't get clinical trials done of the most basic questions. The UK has cleaned our clock in therapeutic trials now, demonstrating the only treatment now that prevents death from COVID in a trial with 11,000, 12,000 people when their population is about a sixth of ours. And the government, the NIAID, can only get a trial done of remdesivir that's not powered for mortality with like 1,000 people or something like that. And, the inequities are not new. It's just like right now we're talking about them. But, I live in New York City, and, it's commonly said that you lose 6 months of life expectancy for every minute on the subway as you ride from the Upper East Side to the Bronx. And that's about right. Men between the Bronx and the Upper East Side have a 10-year life expectancy gap. And we even know this for vaccines. When Gardasil, which is a phenomenal piece of innovation, came on the market, it's a vaccine that we first focused on its ability to prevent cervical cancer. It also prevents head and neck cancer. But because it prevented cervical cancer, we hoped it did, and I believe it will, that it went to girls first, and it systematically went to girls of privilege who were in neighborhoods that were wealthy, and didn't go to girls who were in poor communities and poor states. And what's wrong about that is not just that it's inequitable, but all the cervical cancer deaths, or nearly all of them, happen in poor communities because wealthy girls also, as they grow up, have access to the Pap smear and other things that prevent cervical cancer death. So it's this hugely inefficient distribution that mirrors everything that goes on in healthcare. So diabetes, obesity, poor nutrition, lack of access to education, these things all track perfectly, and they explain these large life expectancy gaps ultimately. And so there's every reason to believe we will bungle this as well. And I hope, and I think most people who worry about this think if we collect better data, we will at least have to stare it in the face and try and do something about it. But nevertheless, it is fully predictable that we will fail to serve those who are being hurt the most by this. The mortality rates from infection are the highest in the poor, and they're highest in people in assisted living facilities, whom we might get to. The other thing about the vaccine is it really bums me out that this seems to be our plan A. As I showed on the slide earlier, our plan A should probably be something where we have certainty, which would be basic public health measures. This is not some fiction or some theory of some nerds at Johns Hopkins. You can see in Europe that the basic effort of testing and tracking and isolating doesn't drive rates down to zero, but it drives rates down a lot. And the therapeutic benefit of reducing infection rates today from that, in terms of the life expectancy gain, will swamp the future benefits of a vaccine for a very long time. And so I'm really concerned, although completely unsurprised, that the U.S. has taken public health, that's for everybody else. We're going to, invent our way out of this problem while, people are dying around us.
Thank you for that comment. I do want to pivot because the term international has come up a couple of times now. Mary, could you tell us a little bit about some of the unique international partnerships that are occurring now around COVID-19, whether it's vaccine or whether it's therapeutics? And what of this do you think has momentum going forward, or what is sort of unique to these circumstances today for this pandemic?
Sure. Thanks, Alison. And I think it's a really important reminder that I appreciate that system can be a loaded word, but it is an ecosystem, and that all drug and vaccine and therapeutic development, and I want to be mindful of the terms of art here, is truly global. And so acknowledging that this means, as you think through the different moving pieces, that regulatory processes need to be scalable, and that one of the things, and I know Marta can be much more articulate here, is as we think about the differences in the U.S. regulatory system from our colleagues in Europe and Japan and other regions of the world that have very established protocols, that we have an opportunity to all be better and to think through these conversations at the most strategic of levels. And so one of the things that the U.S. regulatory authority, not just through some of the efforts, and I'm putting aside a lot of those conversations going on around Operation Warp Speed, because I'm really talking about the underpinning regulatory science and the data that is needed for submission of confirming safe and effective use of activities. And I say that in the most broad of senses. So, you know, one of the things that the industry is doing is not just thinking through what has worked, but what's not worked. So we're taking lessons learned from previous pandemics. We're thinking about what it is that are working in different regions, and knowing that for the EMA, for example, they've decentralized a lot of their reviews. So how do we make sure that we are all thinking through the harmonization activities that have been longitudinally successful and try to elevate the conversation? I think that, you know, the direct dialogue that the U.S. FDA is providing with sponsors has been very helpful in expediting things. I think the flexibilities that we're seeing from the regulatory authorities domestically are translating to those ex-U.S. as well. And so I'm acknowledging that, as with anything, open and consistent conversation has allowed us to think through what partnerships are just at the regulatory level. The companies are thinking through where their regional capabilities are, and not just from a technical perspective, but also capacity and capability. Marta, maybe this would be a great chance for you to highlight some of the things, and you focused yesterday on therapeutics, but knowing that Duke Margolis is really thinking through some of those global implications, I feel like that's an important reminder as well.
And if you could add, Marta, as you think about your take on these international collaborations, a portion, if not a non-trivial portion, of pharmaceutical R&D spending is recaptured from higher prices in the U.S. And should this weigh into our thinking about any of the COVID therapeutics in this space?
Yeah, thanks for the question. So, you know, the international component it kind of shows up, and Mary, you know, highlighted it, and it shows up on a few levels. On the scientific side, I have been incredibly impressed with how the scientific community and the regulators have come together to sort of support each other. It's really been, you know, the regulators, the NIH, the FDA, together with, you know, a lot of the other regulators and industry have really come together to coordinate their efforts and learn from each other. Where it's been trickier is really on the manufacturing side. There has been an international effort to come together on the manufacturing capacity for vaccines. The United States chose not to participate in it. There hasn't really been much for therapeutics. Some of it, you know, the sort of the manufacturing capacity becomes a bit of a geopolitical issue. So again, you know, ex-US countries have tried to address it on the vaccine side. What we have seen, for example, with hydrochloroquine, when that first demand for it spiked, a few things happened. Number one is, you know, India basically blocked exports of it, but also there is an API facility in Hungary. So this is the ingredient to make the drug. And the government basically stepped in and they said, we're going to release it to, you know, for the company to release it, but only if you promise us a certain number of finished doses. And, you know, and then also, and on the company side, those tend to be highly proprietary pieces of information that I think it's harder for companies to kind of come together and share information, because when you're talking about a clinical trial for a particular drug, you're just revealing information about that drug. When you're talking about manufacturing, you're revealing it for basically your entire lineup of everything. And so it makes it much more challenging in just so many levels, geopolitical and so on. So when I kind of look at where there is a threat and a gaping hole, it's not the science. It's really then getting that drug made and to the patient. And that's where I perceive sort of the greatest threats and sort of the piece that sort of is not being looked at, but potentially, if you look at this epidemic, this whole epidemic has been about surge demand for something and then not having enough of something. And my concern is that we're going to be the same way, we sort of are thinking about it in the vaccine, but we'll have the same problem with therapeutics if we don't kind of get our act together on this soon.
Excellent. We do also, and maybe Peter, you can address this question, have questions from our audience related to out-of-pocket costs for whatever this therapy might be that could help treat in some fashion or another COVID-19 symptoms. Can you tell us a little bit about what can we do to get ahead of this? We have a number of state policies around cost sharing for different kinds of conditions. We have different payers in this space. Is there anything we could do to get out front of that, or is that just not a good policy move?
Oh, it's a good question. So remdesivir, which we've obviously been talking about, dexamethasone, the drug that also prevents death from COVID in hospital, those are examples where the drug is being administered to people inside the hospital. And so the out-of-pocket costs will probably, in general terms, come out pretty low for them. It depends, of course, on the type of insurance. There's been a lot of rattling around about, not having out-of-pocket costs and not having cost sharing and things like that in this epidemic around testing. I would assume there'd be the same kind of policy momentum around therapeutics and around the vaccines. I do want to raise this concern, however. I am not a fan of high out-of-pocket costs for therapies that actually help people. They do work from a standard economic purpose, which is to reduce the utilization or as leverage for pricing negotiations, but they're unappealing in terms of generating health. But if we do say no copays and things like that, it will be open season on pricing with the caveats that Marta raised, that I raised also in my slides, which is there's a lot of PR risk here for companies doing the wrong thing. But once that dam breaks, or once there's a way to hide what the true costs are, which is something that is widespread in the U.S. pharmaceutical market, of course, all prices are actually confidential. We can only see the average prices across some payment silos, and can see some list prices, which are generally irrelevant except for what patients pay are based on them. But I think we just have to be thoughtful that we don't go waive copays and by fiat and not do anything about pricing.
Excellent. All right, so we just have 3 more minutes. Mary, can I, in a minute, get what positive or cautionary lesson have we learned so far around innovation in this space?
Thanks, Alison. Well, so far, I think that the jury's still out. I think that there's still a lot of conversations that we have to have. I feel like that's really, having served through a few pandemics on the government side of things, I think it's a really good opportunity for us to say there's still so much we don't know. Let the data drive the conversation, ask the right questions, be willing to hear all different pieces of the ecosystem. I think that we should trust that the biopharmaceutical industry is doing everything it can to get things both from the therapeutics innovative as well as off-the-shelf capabilities ready as soon as possible, and partnering to understand what that means in terms of prioritizing needs and getting things to patients. I think that's where our heads are at, and that's what we're trying to do, and let science lead the course.
Great. How about you, Marta? What's the one lesson you want us to take away?
That coordination really matters. We have seen places like on PPE where this just was a complete breakdown, where you pass it on to states and you go figure it out how to do it, including sort of how you distribute remdesivir. What's happening with Operation Warp Speed on vaccines is really encouraging, and I hope that this kind of let's get everybody together and have this one coordinating body, which actually is the federal government, BARDA, Operation Warp Speed, really makes a difference, and I really hope we can do it for therapeutics.
Great. And Peter?
Yes. Well, first of all, thank you for having me, and I hope it was useful. I do want to, so I hate to be the Debbie Downer in this conversation. I love all the collaboration. I do want to emphasize 2 points. One is that, we have systematically privatized innovation in the U.S. in particular, but globally as well, which is why we are now in a position where we need these things that are being called public-private partnerships. But we have to be a little bit cautious We do have a separation of church and state principle here in terms of the development versus the evaluation of new therapies and vaccines. It couldn't be more important when it comes to either, that we don't rush, that we don't guess when we should be studying things. And to the extent that there is alignment, coordination, collaboration between a regulatory agency that is intended to ensure the safety of the public and the biopharmaceutical industry in this case, which intent is to enrich shareholders through creating new drugs, there will eventually be a point where one party thinks it's got enough and the other party doesn't. And if the more we try to harmonize those activities, the greater the risk that through no ill intent of anyone, we end up with relatively unsafe products, or we end up with clinical trial designs or evaluations that are soft in terms of looking for adverse events. And I'm not trying to fearmonger here, just I know something about the history of vaccine development. And there have been a lot of examples where well-meaning scientists have developed vaccines that didn't work, caused problems, caused syndromes worse than they were intended to prevent, were ineffective, had manufacturing problems. I don't want to see any of those things happen here, but the way we've always gotten there is with this sort of yin-yang of there's an entity trying to make money on the market and there's an entity trying to regulate who gets on the market based on what's in the public. So let's be careful.
All right. Thank you for that caution. And thank you. It sounds like we should have an entire session on that another day. And thank you, everyone, for being with us today, and to our panelists. Really just tremendous. Thank you so much for your time.
Thanks so much, Alison.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, Alison. Thank you, Jimmy.